January 14th, 1942. 2:17 a.m. Saratov Aircraft Factory. Number 292. The Volga River groans under a sheet of ice as the night shift fights the cold inside the cavernous assembly hall. Steam clouds rise from the mouths of exhausted workers as they haul metal frames across the concrete floor. The overhead lamps flicker, throwing long shadows across half-finished Yak-1 fuselages lined up like skeletal beasts in the darkness. A radio crackles somewhere with distant reports from the front. Moscow's defenses straining, Leningrad starving, German armor pushing ever eastward. The entire building feels stretched to the breaking point. So do the people inside it. You can almost feel the cold metal tools in their hands, the sting of grease, the weight of urgency. And in the middle of this chaos stands a 26-year-old civilian foreman named Alexei Petrov, coat unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up, palms raw from another 16-hour shift. He watches as two mechanics struggle to maneuver a steel jig into position, aligned beneath a Yak's central frame. The alignment is off by a few degrees. Again, it will cost them another hour they don't have. A siren howls outside, not for an air raid, but for shift change. It doesn't matter. No one moves. The war doesn't wait for rotations. Petrov runs a hand through his hair, looks at the ceiling, exhales a long, freezing breath. He knows the numbers better than anyone. Stalin's order had come down in December. Output must increase drastically. The Red Air Force is losing fighters faster than factories can replace them. German Bf-10-9s dominate the skies over the front, and every day the Soviet lines buckle under Stuka dives. Yak fighters are the backbone of Soviet resistance, but they're arriving too slowly, far too slowly. Another crash echoes across the factory. A mechanic curses. A fuselage jig slips again, its wooden support blocks uneven from overuse. Petrov steps forward. "Stop!" he calls out, his voice sharp enough to cut through the machinery. The workers freeze. He kneels beside the jig, runs his fingers along the warped wood. He's seen this failure hundreds of times. These jigs were never built for speed. They're meant for precision. But in wartime, precision without efficiency means death. He turns slowly, scanning the hall. Everywhere he looks, he sees the same problem: bottlenecks, frames waiting for alignment, wings waiting for fastening, workers waiting for tools, for space, for parts. An entire factory gridlocked by a design that made sense in peacetime, but now sabotages them by the minute. A cold realization crawls over him. We will never meet the quota like this, not with endless jigs, not with these layouts, not with this war closing in. The radio snaps again. A courier plane from the Kalinin front didn't return. Another Yak pilot gone, another empty seat that this factory is meant to fill. Petrov starts pacing, fast, desperate. His mind turns gears the way his hands usually turn wrenches. Every few seconds he stops, stares at something. A support beam, a tool rack, a cluttered walkway, then moves on. Something is forming. He looks again at the warped jig, then at the next one, then the next. Rows of near-identical time-wasting devices stretching into the gloom. And suddenly, a spark. Not inspiration, not genius, a shortcut. A way to do the same work with fewer jigs, far fewer, without sacrificing alignment or rigidity. The idea hits him so hard he whispers aloud, "Why are we doing this step 3 times, when once is enough?" He's already scribbling on a scrap of packaging paper. Triangles, load points, locking pins, a single reinforced jig frame that can cradle the entire fuselage and wings simultaneously. A structure that pivots, rotates, locks, letting mechanics work all around the fighter at once instead of queuing endlessly for separate stations. If it works, it could cut assembly time nearly in half. If it fails, well, nothing could be worse than the pace they already have. A worker approaches him cautiously. Comrade Petrov, are we continuing with alignment? Petrov folds the paper into his pocket. Not tonight, he says. He strides toward the design office, boots echoing loudly through the freezing hall. Workers stare. Some whisper. No one quite knows what he's seen, but something in his eyes tells them it's different. He pushes open the office door, slams it shut behind him, and spreads the scrap across a drafting table. His pencil dances, carving new lines, erasing old assumptions. Outside, drills whine, metal clatters, engines cough to life. But Petrov hears none of it. All he hears is the ticking of the clock. Every tick, another pilot lost. Every tick, another German advance. Every tick, another yak that isn't in the sky. He mutters to himself, if this works, it changes everything. But there's a problem. To use this jig, he'll have to convince the factory director, Nikolai Voronov, a stern veteran of the pre-war industrial system, a man who trusts process, discipline, and committees, not the ideas of young foremen who sketch designs at 2 a.m. Petrov glances toward the shadowed hallway outside his office. Voronov won't just need convincing, he'll need proof, which means Petrov must build a prototype, tonight, with whatever scraps he can find. He rolls up his sleeves. This is where the story really begins. Petrov steps back into the factory floor, the cold hitting him like a wave. It's now almost 3 a.m. The night shift is thinning, but the air still hums with the last groans of machinery being shut down for maintenance. Perfect. Fewer eyes, fewer questions, fewer chances for anyone to stop him. He heads straight for the scrapyard behind Assembly Line 2, a dim corridor where discarded beams, bent brackets, and old jig components sit piled like bones. The overhead lights buzz and flicker, casting a ghostly shimmer across the metal. Petrov pulls the folded sketch from his pocket, spreads it on a crate, and analyzes it one more time. A single rotating jig frame. 3 locking arms, a universal cradle for fuselage, wings and tail assembly, everything accessible at once. It looks insane, reckless, impossible, but so does losing this war. He starts dragging metal toward an empty patch of floor. Hammer strikes echo through the hall. A welder from the night shift, a quiet man named Sergei Vasilyev, wanders over, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What are you doing, Alexei?" he asks. Petrov doesn't stop working. Something stupid, or brilliant, we'll know by dawn. Sergei chuckles, but when he sees the intensity in Petrov's face, he sobers. "Tell me what you need." Petrov hands him the sketch. Sergei whistles sharply. "This will either kill us or promote you." "Let's hope for the second," Petrov replies. Within minutes, more workers join. A pair of mechanics from Omsk, a machinist named Olga, 2 night laborers hauling rivet trays. They don't know the full plan. They don't need to. They trust Petrov. He's the foreman who listens, who works beside them, who knows which tools jam and which shortcuts save their fingers. Together, they begin building the prototype under the freezing lamps. Sparks rain like fireflies as Sergei welds the central support beams. Olga reshapes locking pins on a lathe, her hands steady despite the cold. The others scavenge bolts, wheels, clamps, anything that might fit. Time evaporates. Each clang, each shower of sparks, each rasp of a file feels like defiance, like survival, like the front-line soldiers will feel this work by sunrise. Then, near 5 a.m., the jig takes shape. A hulking metal frame stands before them, crude, uneven, ugly, but strong. Petrov circles it like a sculptor inspecting a statue. He runs his fingers along the welds, the joints, the hinges. "Rotate it," he orders. 3 workers push. The frame groans, resists, then slowly pivots on its axis. It works, roughly, awkwardly, but it works. Sergei laughs out loud. "You madman! You actually did it!" Petrov steps back, his breath shaking in the cold. For a moment, he allows himself hope. Real hope. But then, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, unmistakable. Petrov's heart drops. Through the dim light strides Director Voronov. Greatcoat draped over his shoulders, cap pulled low, jaw set like stone. He surveys the scene, the workers, the tools, the improvised jig towering over them, his eyes narrow. "Explain," Voronov says quietly. Petrov starts to speak, but the words jam like a misfed cartridge. He forces himself to steady. "Comrade Director, we cannot meet the new output quotas. Our workflow gridlocks because we're using 3 jigs where 1 should be enough. So Voronov raises a hand. Silence. He walks around the prototype slowly, boots clicking against the concrete. His gloved hand traces a weld seam, then another. He tests a hinge, a pivot lock. He examines each part like a surgeon diagnosing a wounded patient. The workers stand frozen. No one breathes. Finally, Voronov stops in front of Petrov. "This is not regulation," he says. "I know," Petrov replies. "This is not standard procedure." "I know. This could break. It could injure workers. It could halt production entirely." Petrov swallows. "I know." Voronov steps closer. "And you built it anyway." Petrov meets his gaze. "Because if we don't change how we work, we will never build enough fighters. And if we don't build enough fighters, the front will collapse." The factory falls silent. The only sound is the groan of metal cooling. Then, unexpectedly, Voronov speaks, softer than before. "Rotate it." The workers exchange uncertain glances, then push together. The jig turns, smoother this time, almost graceful. Voronov lets out a breath through his nose, a breath that could be frustration or admiration. Hard to tell. He looks at Petrov again. "If this fails, you will answer for it." Petrov nods. "But if it succeeds," Voronov continues, "then tomorrow we begin reorganizing the entire factory around your design." A bead of stunned silence. Then Voronov turns sharply and walks away, leaving Petrov and the workers staring at the prototype, now illuminated by the first gray light of dawn creeping through the factory windows. Petrov exhales, his breath trembling. The jig stands before them like a steel promise. Now they must prove it works, and that test will happen under the full weight of the war. The factory whistles blow at 6 o'clock, sharp and shrill, cutting through the cold like a blade. Workers pour into the assembly hall, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, unaware that history is waiting inside. Petrov stands beside the prototype jig, trying to look calm, though the pulse in his neck betrays him. A Yak-1 fuselage shell sits on a wheeled cradle nearby, the chosen subject of the test. It's unfinished, unpainted, still smelling of machine oil and raw alloy. If the new jig fails, this frame will be destroyed. So will Petrov's reputation, and possibly much more. Voronov returns with 3 senior engineers at his side, men with stiff collars and colder expressions. They stare at the jig as if it were a mutinous soldier. "Begin," Voronov orders. Petrov signals to Sergei and Olga. Together, they maneuver the fuselage onto the jig. The workers move as if handling a wounded comrade, careful, deliberate, coordinated. Metal groans. Clamps lock. The device shudders, then stabilizes. The engineers whisper among themselves. Petrov can't hear their words, but the tone is unmistakable. Skepticism sharpened into knives. He wipes his palms on his trousers. "Rotate it to assembly position." The workers push. The jig resists for a moment, then turns. Smoother than the night before, but still heavy. As it rotates, the yak frame tilts, pivots, and comes to rest at an angle that exposes the underside perfectly. Mechanics gather around instinctively, craning forward like spectators at a duel. "Proceed," Voronov says. A mechanic steps in to begin attaching the wing roots, a job that normally requires multiple hours and 2 separate jigs. But now, with everything accessible at once, he moves faster. His tools find space easily. Another mechanic joins him, then another. The engineers lean in, watching each motion with clinical severity. Bolts tighten, ribs align, panels slide into place. Minutes pass. Then something unexpected happens. The workers stop moving methodically and start moving instinctively, efficiently, almost gracefully. They fall into a rhythm the factory has never seen before. No jostling, no waiting, no stepping aside to give someone else room. Petrov sees it first, then Sergei, then Voronov. The entire workflow has changed. 2 workers lock down the wings while a third attaches the engine cowling. Another teams up with Olga to secure the lower fuselage access panels. Tasks once separated by hours blend into a single, continuous motion. One engineer's jaw tightens, another adjusts his glasses. The third scribbles notes furiously. Petrov barely breathes. 10 minutes, 20, 30. By the 45-minute mark, the Yak looks more complete than it would after 2 hours on the old system. Mechanics step back, sweat glistening on their foreheads despite the cold. One of the engineers breaks the silence. "Impossible." Another shakes his head. "Even if optimized, this is an acceleration of, what, 40%? 50? Sergei grins. "Half the time, maybe better." But Voronov says nothing. He walks slowly around the plane, tracing each seam, each joint. He checks the wing alignment by eye, the old craftsman's test. He studies the rivets, the panel flush, the structural connections. Finally, he stands before Petrov. "Rotate it again." The workers push. The jig turns, exposing the upper fuselage. Mechanics instinctively approach again, ready to continue work. Voronov raises a hand. They stop. He looks directly at Petrov. The entire factory feels suspended in that moment. "This," Voronov says, "is the future of Soviet aircraft production." A wave of murmurs ripples through the hall. Some workers even exhale with audible relief. Others exchange glances filled with pride, disbelief, and a spark of hope. Petrov closes his eyes for a heartbeat, just long enough to steady himself. When he opens them, Voronov continues, "As of today, we begin constructing 20 more of these jigs. Production lines will be reorganized, schedules revised, processes rewritten. Every Yak-1 and Yak-9 built in this factory will use your method." He pauses, then adds quietly, but with unmistakable weight, "And we will inform Moscow." Petrov's breath catches. To inform Moscow means this isn't just a factory success. This is a wartime directive in the making, a national shift, a potential breakthrough in the fight for control of the skies. But with that realization comes a cold ripple across the back of his neck. If Moscow approves, this factory becomes a critical target. More output means more attention. More attention means more danger. And the Germans know exactly how to break Soviet morale, burn its factories. Voronov speaks again, almost reading Petrov's expression. "Your jig may save us, but it will also put us directly in the enemy's sights." A distant boom echoes from across the river, a reminder that the Luftwaffe is never far and never idle. Petrov looks at the prototype, the Yak, the workers gathering with new energy in their eyes. They've gained speed, they've gained hope, but they've also stepped onto a battlefield of a different kind. And the first test is only the beginning. The news spreads through Saratov factory number 292 faster than steam from a ruptured pipe. By midday, The prototype jig has become a gathering point. Workers circling it with cautious awe, engineers measuring angles, and senior officials scribbling notes with frantic urgency. The once chaotic hall now hums with a new rhythm, faster, sharper, purposeful. But outside the factory walls, the world is shifting as well. January 18th, 1942, mid-afternoon. Snow sweeps across the Volga like wind-driven smoke, and far above the clouds, reconnaissance aircraft from Luftwaffe foretrace quiet arcs toward Soviet industrial zones. The enemy is hunting for signs of accelerated production, new assembly patterns, increased shipments, any hint that the Red Air Force is finding its footing again. And in Saratov, something has indeed changed. Inside the design office, Petrov stands with Voronov and 3 production chiefs as they pore over revised workflow charts. The numbers feel unreal. Projected output increases of 40%, possibly 50%. If additional jigs are completed on time, if material shipments arrive, if they avoid sabotage, breakdown, or bombing, it could alter the air war. Voronov taps a pencil against the table. Comrade Petrov, Moscow will expect a demonstration of consistent throughput, not a one-time miracle. I understand, Petrov replies, and they will want to know why no other plant has done this. Petrov hesitates. Because no one asked if the old way could be changed. Voronov almost smiles. Almost. But then the door bursts open and a maintenance foreman, breathing hard, leans in. Director, the electrical inspectors found damage along the northern conduit. Not where? Deliberate cuts. The room stills. Sabotage. It's a dirty word in wartime Russia, one that can end careers, or worse, with a single accusation. But the evidence is unmistakable. Voronov's voice turns to stone. Lock down the line. Increase guards on all supply entrances. No one enters or leaves without identification. He dismisses the foreman and lowers his voice. This factory is now producing more fighters than any German intelligence report predicted. They will respond. Petrov feels a cold weight settle in his chest. Speed is one thing. Survival is another. That evening, as the sun slips behind the frozen horizon, Petrov walks the assembly hall alone. The workers have gone home. Only the low hum of heating boilers echoes through the vast space. He runs his hand along the new jig, smoother now, reinforced, painted with fresh primer. 20 more frames are in various stages of construction, scattered like monuments to defiance. He thinks of the pilots who will fly these planes, men like Lieutenant Sergei Kurdyumov, whose Yak-1 was torn apart by German fire 2 months ago. Men fighting with everything they have, outnumbered, outgunned, but not yet broken. Petrov whispers to himself, if we can build faster, they can survive longer. A metallic clatter interrupts the silence. Petrov turns sharply. A figure stands near the half-lit supply racks, hunched, moving slowly, too slowly for normal inspection. When Petrov calls out, the figure bolts, sprinting toward the rear exit. Petrov gives chase. Boots slam across concrete, echoing through the darkened hall. The intruder weaves between fuselage frames, slips behind fuel drums, and lunges toward a side door leading into the snow-covered loading yard. The door crashes open. Cold wind blasts in. Petrov lunges, not fast enough to catch, but fast enough to grab a sleeve. The fabric tears in his hand. The figure disappears into the blizzard. Moments later, guards rush in, rifles raised. "Saboteur!" Petrov gasps. He was inside the supply racks. They scatter into the storm, but the night swallows everything. Back inside, Petrov studies the torn cloth in his hand. Coarse, dark, not part of any factory uniform. A fragment of foreign stitching along the seam. Not a worker, not a Soviet, someone else. When Voronov arrives minutes later, Petrov hands him the torn sleeve. Voronov examines it under the lamp. His face hardens. "We have been targeted, which means," he looks up, "your innovation threatens them?" Petrov feels a strange mixture of fear and pride. If German agents are infiltrating the outskirts, it means the jig is working. It means Yak fighters will soon be rolling off the line faster than the Luftwaffe can shoot them down. But it also means the enemy will try again. Voronov lowers the cloth. His voice is low and grim. "We must accelerate even further before they strike in force." Petrov nods, adrenaline still burning in his veins. The factory can increase output. Workers can push harder. The jig can be replicated. But what comes next will test more than machinery, because the Luftwaffe does not tolerate miracles on Soviet soil. And if they find out exactly what Saratov has achieved, they will come. February 2nd, 1942. 4:41 a.m. A cold gray dawn bleeds slowly over Saratov. The Volga lies silent beneath a crust of ice, and the city's chimneys exhale slow, ghostly plumes into the morning air. Inside factory number 292, workers shuffle in under the dim lights, clutching tin mugs of tea, unaware that high above the clouds, danger is already forming. At 12,000 feet, a formation of Heinkel He-11s pulses steadily eastward, escorted by Bf-11's fighters. Their engines hum like distant thunder. Their bellies carry high explosive gifts intended for one target: Saratov. More precisely, its aircraft factories. German reconnaissance photos had recently shown something impossible: Yak fighters appearing at the front in numbers that defied all previous forecasts. Reports whispered of assembly times cut dramatically, output rising almost overnight. Berlin wanted answers. The Luftwaffe sent bombs. Inside the factory, Petrov reviews the latest assembly numbers with Voronov. 20 new jigs are active now. The hall looks transformed. Cleaner lines, faster movement, workers sliding between tasks with practiced choreography. The first Yak-9 frames have begun flowing through the line. "Another increase of 12%, Voronov says, tapping the clipboard. "If we maintain this pace for 2 more weeks..." A dull tremor shakes the windows. Petrov freezes. Not a truck, not a train. A distant whine rises, faint but rising fast. Voronov's eyes widen. "Get everyone to cover, now." The factory sirens erupt in a single, long, wailing note. Workers sprint between fuselages and jigs, diving behind reinforced support pillars. Machinery is shut down by instinct, muscle memory born of a year of total war. But this time feels different, sharper, closer. Petrov grabs Sergei by the arm. "Help me secure the fuel drums." Together, they shove the heavy cylinders behind a steel blast wall. Around them, the entire hall moves like a living organism. Shouts, boots hammering concrete, tools dropped mid-task, the thunder of thousands of cubic feet of air being sucked downward by approaching bombs. Then, a whistle, a scream, impact. The first blast slams into the southern end of the complex, sending a shockwave through the hall. Steel groans. Windows explode inward. Dust blooms like volcanic ash. Petrov hits the floor as debris rains around him. A Yak fuselage swings violently on its jig, nearly tearing free before locking back into place. Another blast. Closer. The overhead lamps flicker, die, then surge back to life. Voronov shouts over the chaos, "Keep your heads down! Protect the jigs!" It's a strange command, almost absurd in the middle of an air raid, but Petrov understands. The jigs are the factory now. Without them, the miracle dies. A third explosion tears open the wall near assembly line 5. Fire spills across the floor, rolling toward wooden crates stacked with fabric-covered wing components. Petrov leaps up. "Sergei, get extinguishers!" Sergei and two others race toward the flames, fighting the heat with soapy foam that melts into steaming puddles. The fire hisses, sputters, fights back. The ground shakes again, this time with a sickening crunch, a direct hit on the adjacent machine shop. The doors blast outward in a firestorm of sparks and shattered tools. Petrov hears screams. He moves toward the doorway, but Voronov grabs his shoulder. "Stay here! You're needed at the line!" "I can help them. You can help all of them if you keep this factory alive." The logic hits like a blow. Petrov hesitates only a heartbeat, then nods. He races back to the prototype jig, where Olga and two machinists are covering it with a tarp to protect the alignment surfaces from falling debris. Another bomb hits nearby, and the floor trembles violently. A massive ceiling truss groans, shifts, drops. "Move!" Petrov yells. The beam crashes down, slamming onto the old assembly stands, the ones no one uses anymore. The jigs from the old system collapse like paper models. Workers stare, stunned. If the new jigs hadn't replaced them, dozens would be dead. Dust settles. The bombs keep falling, but farther away now. The Heinkels are drifting off course under heavy Soviet anti-aircraft fire. For a full minute after the last explosion, no one speaks. Just the hiss of settling dust and distant artillery echoes outside the city. Then Voronov pushes himself to his feet. His coat is torn, his cap gone, his face streaked with soot. "Sound off," he roars. "Everyone sound off." Voices call back, one by one, some weak, some shaking, fewer than he hoped, more than he feared. When the final voice answers, a heavy silence follows. Petrov surveys the hall. The walls are cracked. The roof is punctured in 3 places. Half the windows are gone. A corner of the machine shop burns in controlled containment. But the jigs, every single new jig, stands intact. Voronov turns to Petrov, breathing hard. "They targeted us, but they failed." Petrov wipes soot from his face. "They'll come again." "Yes," Voronov says, "but next time we will be ready." A mechanic approaches, holding something in his shaking hands, a jagged chunk of shrapnel, still hot. "It landed beside the Yak," he says quietly. "Missed the frame by centimeters." Petrov takes it, feels the heat searing into his glove. He looks at the new assembly line, at the fighters taking shape faster than ever before, and at the bomb shard that nearly erased the miracle before it could take flight. The war for the skies has now reached Saratov's doorstep, and the enemy won't stop until the jigs, and everything they represent, are ashes on the floor. The following morning, Saratov wakes under a thin veil of smoke. Snowflakes drift through the ragged holes in the factory roof, melting into the dust that coats every surface. Workers arrive in stunned silence, stepping around cratered asphalt and twisted steel. The air smells of burned rubber and cold metal, the scent of a city that survived by inches. Petrov stands alone beside the prototype Yak-9 frame. The fuselage is streaked with soot, but untouched. He runs his hand along its skin, feeling the faint hum of potential inside the silent hall. You can almost sense the heartbeat returning. Voronov approaches, his boots crunching over shattered glass. "Repairs begin today," he says. "We don't stop, not for anything." There's no debate, no time for grief, only momentum. By noon, the factory becomes a hive again. Welders patch ruptured beams. Mechanics rewire lighting suspended from temporary scaffolds. Crews clear debris in coordinated sweeps, carving open paths to the assembly line, and Petrov, soot still in his hair, eyes red from smoke, climbs onto a crate to address the entire hall. He's never spoken to this many people before. Hundreds of faces turn up to him, workers, machinists, engineers, teenagers drafted from technical schools, women with bandaged hands from last night's chaos. He clears his throat. "We were hit hard," he begins. His voice cracks, So he tries again. But the line is still here. The jigs are still standing. Our work lives. A murmur ripples through the hall. They attacked us because they know what we're building. They know what you've achieved, and they fear it. He lifts the shard of bomb shrapnel still wrapped in his glove. This fell less than a meter from your fighter, the one that will defend the men over Stalingrad, the one a pilot will trust with his life. He tosses the shrapnel onto the floor. The clatter echoes like defiance. If they come again, they'll find us faster, stronger, and producing more aircraft than they ever believed possible. For a moment, silence. Then applause erupts, raw, uneven, but fierce, a sound that feels like the first breath after drowning. Voronov steps beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Back to work," he orders the crowd. "Let's show them what Saratov can do." What follows is a transformation no one in the Soviet command could have predicted. By late February, the factory outpaces every estimate. By March, the first new Yak-9s take flight directly from the Saratov airstrip, engines roaring over the same neighborhood cratered by German bombs. By April, production nearly doubles again. Frontline pilots notice immediately. Captain Vasily Golubev writes in his logbook, "Something's changed. We're receiving replacements before the old ones even cool in their smoking craters. Whoever redesigned those lines, they've saved lives you'll never count." Another pilot jokes, "The Yak comes faster now than the Luftwaffe can shoot them down." It's not far from the truth. The Yak-1 and the evolving Yak-9 models begin flowing east and south in numbers the Germans never expected to see again after 1941. Squadrons, once down to a handful of aircraft, suddenly field fully operational wings. And in those desperate months of 1942, when the Red Army stands on the razor's edge of collapse, Soviet air superiority begins, slowly, stubbornly, to return. Because of hours saved, because of simplicity, because a young foreman saw what others overlooked. One night, long after the final shift, Petrov walks the quiet line alone. The jigs gleam under newly installed lamps. Half-assembled fighters rest like sleeping beasts awaiting their wings. He thinks of the raid. He thinks of the factory workers who didn't survive, and he thinks of the pilots who will soon take these machines into the sky. He whispers, almost to himself, "Fly well." A distant engine growls outside, another Yak, on a test run. Its shadow flickers across the cracked windows, soaring upward into the freezing Saratov night. Petrov watches until the sound fades. He doesn't smile. He doesn't need to. The work speaks louder than he ever could. And somewhere far to the west, over smoking fields and burning cities, a Soviet pilot will soon look over his shoulder at a diving Messerschmitt and think, "Thank God they built these in time.